In this video, we're going to be talking about purposes 6 through 10 of the 10 purposes for pedagogical translanguaging. The first purpose, or reason why you would intentionally create spaces for students to bring their full linguistic repertoire into the classroom is to help students make cross-linguistic connections. Now, the terminology here is tricky because the goal of translanguaging really is to kind of move away from us thinking about languages as separate entities, right? And to recognize that for a bilingual or multilingual person, they have one holistic repertoire that they're drawing from as they make meaning. And yet we know that languages do have particular lexicon or vocabulary associated with them. They have particular grammar rules that they follow. So we're using this term cross-linguistic to think about kind of how languages are similar to or different from one another, while also recognizing, again, that kind of languages don't exist as static things, but they are constantly evolving. And for a bilingual or multilingual person, the languages are not these kind of separate entities. So with that preface, what it looks like to cultivate spaces for these cross-linguistic connections can look different in different classrooms. In bilingual spaces and bilingual learning contexts, classrooms should be full of these types of anchor charts because there are so many wonderful opportunities to help students make connections across what they know in one language to the other. These are two great examples of anchor charts that show supporting students in learning the vocabulary that they've been learning in math across both languages and in about the weather and climate in both languages. And you can see the teacher's attention to looking for cognates. So we talked about that in the last video, right? Looking for these words that have similar spelling, similar pronunciation, and the same meaning, like tornado and tornado, which are exactly the same words, right? And then you also just are supporting students and growing their vocabulary, growing their knowledge across their entire linguistic repertoire as they're looking for these similarities and differences. And you can draw attention to more than just vocabulary. You can look at grammatical structure. There's a lot that you can explore. So this is to create anchor charts that are doing that kind of bridging. Another way to do that is to compare texts in the same genre in different languages and think about what's similar and different as you look across the text. So this is a great way to also build metalinguistic awareness, right? So this is the text that you see, wolves in English, los lobos in Spanish, is structured as a report. So you can think about, okay, so how do authors organize reports? How do they, what language features are part of a report? What is the purpose of a report? And then how does the organization, how do the language features and the organization help the text accomplish that purpose, right? So you can have some larger conversations that are more around metalinguistic awareness. But as you compare, you can also think about what's similar and different between this text in English versus this text in Spanish. So I might start with kind of those general genre features, right? So we might read this text and say, okay, so it starts off, but wolves and dogs are different in several ways. And then it goes into some of those details. So we see a topic sentence followed by details. That's very common for a report. I see comparative language in reports. It's often important to compare, right? So we can understand what wolves are by comparing them to dogs, right? So even when we're reading a book about planets, we often see that a planet is compared to the other planet. So if I'm learning about Mars, it's comparing Mars to Earth. So it gives me a comparative lens to understand Mars better, right? So same thing here with wolves. So I see comparative language, and the text is written in the third person. So I don't see like, I really like wolves or dogs are my favorite pet, right? So students, when they write reports, sometimes bring those things in, but it's important to show the genre and think about, okay, in this type of text, the goal is not to say what we think about something or how we feel about it. It's really just to communicate information, right, about whatever the topic is. So that helps me think about genre features. Then I can do some analysis of cross-linguistic connections. So I can see that the structure is similar, right? So in Spanish and in English, reports can follow a similar structure, but I see that the comparative language is different. So in English, we have longer snout, stronger jaws, larger teeth as comparative words, right? These ER words. Whereas in English or in Spanish, we see that those words are actually, to compare, we're using two words, right? We're saying más largo. Una mandíbula más fuerte, dientes más grandes. So we see that not only does the comparative words or words come after the noun or the thing that they're describing, but we also see they're using the words more, right? More long, more strong, more big, right? So that's an interesting comparison to point out to students. And articles with nouns. So we see in English, we're using the words wolves and dogs, but in Spanish, you have to put an article with those words, right? So we see los lobos, los perros, the dogs, the wolves. So pointing these things out can help students, again, strengthen in their knowledge of both languages and also become stronger writers and readers overall. And this is an example that would be great to do in a bilingual setting, but you could also do this with students in an English mainstream classroom, bringing in these different texts. And you yourself, if you don't have deep knowledge of students' home language or languages, learning a little bit about them so you can help point out some of these similarities and differences, right? And help students make these cross-linguistic connections to then strengthen their writing in English, but also kind of be able to make these connections across their home language as well. All right, purpose 7, sociocultural competence. So this is a purpose that really gets at using translanguaging as a way for students to develop an understanding of their own cultural group and other cultural groups. So kind of thinking about what culture is and the way in which different people live their lives, how we live cultural lives, and gaining that cross-cultural understanding and awareness through texts that showcase translanguaging or through experiences where they're thinking about translanguaging. So there's so many great books that show the languaging or translanguaging practices of different groups, and it's a great way for them to not only gain a deeper understanding of translanguaging as a lived practice, but also to think about how different groups of people leverage their linguistic resources in different ways. And there's a great website that my colleague, Dr. Meg Burns, created called librosforlanguage.org, where you can find examples of bilingual books and translanguage books. I'm going to share just a few mentor texts on this page that I really like. So Octopus Stew is a fantastic mentor text showcasing a Puerto Rican boy who's growing up in New York and tells this fanciful story about an octopus that comes to life when they're trying to make octopus stew. And what I love about the book is it includes so much translanguaging, and it also includes a lot of language features that are unique to Puerto Rican Spanish. And it showcases an Afro-Latino family, right? So kind of broadening who we think about as being included when we talk about Latinx students. So it's a really great text for that. What can you do with a paleta? Is focused on Mexican students or Mexican-American students who are playing with paletas or popsicles and thinking about all the things they can do with them. And it again kind of showcases great translanguaging in the book. And Subway Sparrow is a book about a sparrow that gets stuck in the subway, and everyone that's on the subway who happen to speak different languages are kind of working together to try to get this bird free and out of the subway car. So it's just a way to kind of validate and hear all of these different languages from all these different groups together as they're working toward a shared goal. I also really love books that showcase students that are kind of in these in-between spaces. And I think about this especially because of my own children who have me as their mother, European American descendants and from the Midwest, white American, and they're my partner who's Cuban American. And so they're kind of also living between these worlds of English and Spanish. So these two books both showcase students or children who have one parent who is Latino and one parent who is white American, and they're kind of navigating these worlds together. So this book by Alma Florada, I Love Saturdays y Domingos, talks about the child spending time with both sides of her family, the Spanish-speaking side and the English-speaking side, and Marisol McDonald Doesn't Match. Marisol McDonald No Combina. It showcases translanguaging, but is also a bilingual book. So there's also part of the text that is exclusively in Spanish. And she's kind of navigating this space too of having a white American father and a Peruvian mother, and kind of what that means for her own identity. So great ways to think about supporting students' sociocultural competence. For those of you who teach upper elementary and older learners, here's a few books that also do a great job showcasing translanguaging and can lead to more kind of deeper critical conversations around language. Red Hot Salsa, you saw a poem from that. I'm from Castilla la Bella that we use during our I Am From Poem Week. That has many poems about being young and Latino in the US. that include translanguaging. House on Mango Street is a wonderful novel that brings in a lot of these components. And then My Name is Jorge on Both Sides of the River has poems in English and Spanish that are simple, but can be used to really dig deep into kind of how we think about culture and language and power in meaningful ways. In addition to reading texts that showcase these different groups, you can also analyze the texts that showcase translanguaging and think about why the author is translanguaging in the book. What is the purpose of the Spanish use, for example, in this English book? And how is it telling us something, about the characters or about the story? So you can read more about this if you go to this Matt Soul article that I wrote with a colleague. But just to briefly explain the strategy, you can create a simple chart where students have to identify examples of translanguaging, or in this case, use of Spanish in this text, and then think about why the author used Spanish. So for example, in the whole text, except for the title, the dish is called pulpo guisado instead of octopus stew because it's a Puerto Rican dish. So the family would probably call it by that name, right, instead of saying octopus stew. We see examples of the grandma speaking to the boy saying, I've been making pulpo guisado since your dad era un niño, since he was a boy. And so we might say, well, that's showcasing that the grandma speaks both English and Spanish, and that translanguaging is how she communicates with her bilingual family, right? There's a place where he calls his grandmother abuela, which is a nickname for grandma, and it's in particular a Puerto Rican way of saying abuela, right, grandmother. And so you can use this as a way to talk about language and think about the strategic choices that writers make when they're including translanguaging in their texts. All right, purpose 8 kind of builds upon that with a really explicitly critical focus. So purpose 8, translanguaging in the classroom to cultivate students' critical consciousness, where they're kind of critical awareness of the world around them, their own positionality, critical awareness of language and power. This is a key purpose of translanguaging. It's not just to create these spaces where languages are used fluidly or where students are tapping into their full linguistic repertoire, but really to think critically about language in the world, language and power, and how students can start to be advocates to push back against some inequitable structures. So one great way to cultivate critical consciousness is to do a community language map in which students walk around their community, perhaps around the school, and they think about the languages that they see and the way that languages are used in the spaces around them. They might think about why they hear certain languages in one place but not another. They might think about the languages that are visible on the buildings around them. And so this is kind of similar to the Linguistic Landscape project that you just completed, right? So they're thinking about where do they see language and which languages seem to be held up in positions of power and which ones are not, right? And you can extend this to a linguistic landscape where you yourself can go with students or have students take pictures of what they see, or you could bring in images from different places in the community and have students reflect upon what they notice about language, what the use of language tells you about the community that lives there, etc. And finally, another example of this is another example that we looked at last time we were in class together, doing an activity around bilingualism in the public eye, right? So thinking about or having students bring in images and examples of language in the world and think critically about what that tells them, right? So we looked at this example during our synchronous class of Bad Bunny performing at the Grammys and the way that the transcription read speaking non-English, singing non-English as a way to think critically about, which languages get to be transcribed, right? And how we're holding our broadcasting transcription responsible or not for those types of services. So having students bring in these examples is a wonderful way for them to be more actively engaged with thinking critically about language in their world. Purpose number 9 is communicating with diverse audiences. So a beautiful reason for translanguaging is that so students can communicate with different audiences who might be engaging with their words or their texts. One way that I love to do this with students is through bilingual wax museums. I don't have images of the bilingual wax museum that I helped a teacher create in a second grade bilingual classroom, so these are stand-ins, but essentially the students do a report about a given topic, and then they prepare the script for their report in multiple languages. So this works especially well in a bilingual setting, bilingual learning setting, but you could have students do this in an English mainstream classroom as well, where they're prepared to present their report in English or present their report in Spanish, depending on who approaches them. So in a wax museum, students pretend to be kind of a wax figure. They're frozen, and when they're tapped, they come to life and they give their report. So a teacher I worked with in Wisconsin did this with her second grade students around their animal reports. So they were just kind of human figures that were standing. And when they were tapped, they would ask, do you want the report in English or in Spanish? And then they would deliver the report. So it's a great way for them to think about how they can communicate with different audiences by drawing upon their full linguistic repertoire. You can also do this through text. We talked about bilingual and multilingual books last week, but again, this is another example of how you could do this in your classroom. These examples come from the website you see down below, where the books themselves showcase all of the languages in the classroom. So here you see the English text. When your mother speaks to you in one language and your father in another, you are bilingual. So I'm broadening. Thinking about what it means to be bilingual and then having that translated into languages of the classroom. And this is similar to a book that a colleague of mine created with students in Canada, but you can see all of the languages and that they have worked to translate those, find out what the word one is in all of those languages. So they created this math book where they have 1, 2, 3, 4, and in all of the languages of the classroom, they have the translation there. So this is a great resource that you can use to communicate with different audiences, but also is another way for students to make some of those cross-linguistic connections, right? So you can see that they could look down the list and see that, oh, Spanish and French are pretty similar for the word one, right? We have uno and un. So that's interesting to think about the ways that languages are connected. All right, and finally, you can translanguage in the classroom to understand multiple perspectives. So translanguaging can be used for us to bring in perspectives and voices from different groups that we might not otherwise consider to deepen our understanding of a topic or an issue. So one example of this is to do primary source analysis using news stories from different countries. You can bring them in their entirety and you can translate them with students, but it's also good for them to see the original text. And you can think about how different countries report on the same event, right? Or you might look specifically, if you're looking in a Spanish-English setting, how Spanish language newspapers in the US report on the event differently than English language papers. And you might see differences in how an event is talked about. So again, this is a great way for students to have kind of a critical lens on a topic and also to start to understand multiple perspectives on an issue as they're drawing from the languages that are part of their own repertoire or perhaps broader than their repertoire to make meaning. So that is it for the 10 purposes for pedagogical translanguaging. I'm excited to see what you do with purposes 6 through 10 as you continue to think about how these apply in your own context.